Okay, issue 4, Venezuelan misery.
Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido.
He received President Trump's salute earlier this month, but Juan Guaido is no closer to power. More than a year after the Trump administration recognized Guaido as an interim Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro remains entrenched in Caracas. Supported by Cuban security officers, Russian cash, and his patronage relationship with the Venezuelan military, Maduro has refused global calls to step down. But with millions of Venezuelans having fled their nation and child mortality rates skyrocketing, the Trump administration this week sanctioned Russia's Rosneft energy company. The US hopes that Maduro will fall from power if he is unable to sell oil abroad.
Sure, Michael, sanctions obviously hurt people who they're not intended to hurt most of the time. In the context of Maduro's retention of power, is it time for the US to take a different approach here and say, you know what, we don't like him, but we've got to sit down for the benefit of the people and figure out how to form a compromise?
No, I think we're at that point, Tom. I think the UN had a report sometime last year that was talking about how many poor people, elderly people are being impacted by the sanctions of the U.S. government. And I'm certainly sure that the president doesn't want that coming on his desk, that because of our sanctions, we're harming people that we never intended to harm. However, I do think we have to put pressure on Russia. We cannot allow internal chaos in our own backyard, and that's what Russia is doing. And so I think our government has to be very clear that we won't tolerate this, but we also have to be cognizant of the consequences and the impact that it will have on everyday people in Venezuela.
You're a Monroe Doctrine kind of guy.
I am.
Clarence, your thoughts?
I'm a Monroe Doctrine kind of guy, too. This has reminded me a lot of Cuba. I mean, you have Maduro's using this boycott and sanctions to blame us for his problems, which he brought upon himself and inherited much of it from Hugo Chavez, who preceded him. And unfortunately, Guaido has not really been able to consolidate his power down there. We can see from the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets that Venezuelans are very unhappy with their situation there, but they haven't really consolidated support for Guaido either. And I think that the U.S. really is in the seat of power here by having the influence that can bring about a peaceful settlement.
Aside from giving the protest leader a star turn at the State of the Union, I can't tell that the administration has any particular plan of action. And, this president runs a government that is so hollowed out, and he is so distrustful of any of the policy people that I just don't know what comes next. And I think the president sees this as a kind of a card that he can play if Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee. Look, this is what happens. You get Venezuela. Meanwhile, you have Sanders talking on the debate stage about, no, it's more like Denmark. I don't think that's a winning argument for Democrats going into the fall. But I would like it if I felt that this administration had some sort of cogent plan of action, not invading them with troops, nothing radical.
Well, Woodrow Wilson said, these sanctions are the silent, deadly remedy. And the people who are dying down there in Venezuela, the people who've been driven out, the people who've been driven out, 3 or 4 million Venezuelans are gone. All these people that are suffering down there are normal folks, in their own country. And you'd like to work something out. And I think Trump would too, because the idea of dealing with Maduro would be something that would appeal to him, quite frankly. But I think Maduro and some of these thugs in there now, they're just a kakistocracy, a bunch of thieves. They're looting the place, and I don't think they give a hoot about the people. But if I were the Americans, I got Elliot Abrams is running point on this, who did it during the Central America during Reagan's years. But I would like to see something negotiated and get an election down there, if you conceivably could, and put an end to the sanctions, because that's the richest country on earth in terms of oil in the ground.
And is that, going back to this socialist point, is that the ultimate indictment of socialism, right? Because as much as there is the kleptocracy and corruption, there is also ultimately the massive depletion, both in production and in mass mismanagement, which you might say that happens when government controls the levers of energy.
That's not part of the ideology. There you got tyrants on the right wing and left wing. So let's be honest about that.
Yeah, that's about corruption. That's not about socialism.
But wait a minute. Communism does not work. It didn't work in the Soviet Union or East Germany or North Korea or anywhere. China. Communist Party of China, up until this coronavirus,
Right.
I mean, under communism, they built the greatest power on earth economically, second power
That's not real
militarily.
communism. That's state capitalism over there.
Yeah,
in
but
China.
it's capitalism under the Communist Party of the Chinese
Right.
Republic. You know,
State capitalism.
they got total political power.
But I think that the Russians learned from this mistake in the early 1900s, where government became too big. You can't afford it. And so what they began to do, and Pat, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, they began to realize we have to allow some level of capitalism into this, because the whole system within itself is going to explode. And so my question is, for Bernie Sanders, sure, perhaps his intentions are pure, but what happens when Bernie Sanders is replaced by someone who believes we ought to go further? We need to expand government more because we're not doing enough. What is the end result of this, Tom? And that's the question for the Democratic Socialists that we have not answered.
Yeah, Supreme Court.
Yeah,
That's why we have institutions that we have: Congress, Supreme Court. Neither Bernie nor Donald Trump can just have everything they want, regardless of how Trump reads it.
And socialism, while older people may remember negative things about it, younger people look at it as a panacea. He's offering a lot of necessary supports in life, health care,
That's a good point.
college, and so the socialist label may not be as big a negative in November as we all think.
Young
it is
people
today.
need to read more history. That's the
Well,
problem there.
yeah, young people, Eleanor's right. I mean, they're more receptive to the idea of socialism. You mentioned Lenin, exactly, the new economic policy of 1920. They say, wait a minute, this thing isn't working. It's going to blow up on us. And so they ease up on things. But again, the idea that the East Bloc had the best test of a command economy and everything going for them with the Soviets. And the point was, East Germany couldn't compete with West Germany, which was free. They could look right across that wall and see this one's working and this one's not.
So let's reframe this conversation into the broader envelope of sanctions as a national tool of power. Eleanor, do you think that if we look at Iran, for example, where similar suffering is occurring for mixed reasons, our sanctions, poor governance, we had Democrats this week introduce legislation to try and rebuild essentially the Iran nuclear deal. Is it right that we have these sanctions on Iran?
The original sin here is getting out of the Iran nuclear deal. They weren't behaving across the board on every area. They were upholding that, and there was a cap on their nuclear ambitions. And so the president is squeezing them, and they're a proud people. They're an ideological leadership. He hasn't gotten them to capitulate. All he's done is create a lot of misery.
Eleanor's correct, but the thing is, we're choking Iran to death. We're choking that country to death to ask them to conform to what we want them to do. And they're very proud people. The Ayatollahs are an appalling bunch, but I've got real problems, frankly, with what we're doing to countries and peoples with all these sanctions when the option of negotiation might be a little bit better. We're called isolationists, but we want to isolate ourselves from war, not from negotiations and talking with anybody.
I mean, that's correct, Pat. I mean, the whole idea behind sanctions originally was to yield some type of results attributed to the negotiation process. But that hasn't been the case if you look at them historically speaking. And this whole idea and notion that we should negotiate with certain entities is just nonsensical to me, because you cannot get to any favorable results and you end up hurting individuals that you're trying to protect.
We're also driving public opinion against the West, because they see the West now as the great oppressor, where I think at one point they were, after the Iran deal, they were thinking the door was opened to some Western prosperity. Right. So,
but Clarence, would North Korea, for example, have come to the negotiating table absent the really damaging sanctions we'd put on them?
Well, sanctions are a blunt instrument. They are. It's hard to make a surgical strike, if you will. Right. North Korea is not giving up their nukes. Let's be realistic, because they got too much at stake, and we don't really care about the other weapons. So no, I'm not optimistic about us doing that. Although the pressure is good. It's like I said, it's a blunt instrument. Yeah. So it's a matter of how much pressure you put on.
But who's feeling the pressure? I mean, who is suffering in North Korea? It's not the thugs at the top.
They're suffering anyway in North Korea.
People over there in North Korea, many of them trying to escape. They're being killed, trying to get into China and places like that. So we got to take a look at, frankly, the moral component of what these things do.
And Tom, it does permit for groups like ISIS and other terroristic organizations to grow because they now have an argument to say, well, look at what the wicked West is doing to us. Look in your communities, look at your families, look at your neighborhoods. It's because of their sanctions. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that negative impact as we attempt to negotiate and figure out a way to move forward with some of these hostile entities.
Here's a little interesting tidbit we can end on. So in May, we have the celebration, the Soviets of the 75th, end of the Second World War. The Russians are deeply interested in having President Trump come. Should President Trump go? Will he go? Pat, we'll go round.
I believe he should go.
Will he?
I think he might.
Eleanor?
He already accepted that invitation, I believe, and there was a lot of pushback.
And it seemed to sort of disappear.
So, yeah, and so I think in an election year that we're talking this year, right?
Yep.
I say no, he's not going to go.
Okay.
I don't think he should go. After what Russia did in the previous election and what our intelligence agencies have stated they're likely to do again, there is no way in the world the leader of our country should be in Russia. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think our unpredictable president will go because he just loves the ceremony. He just loves it. And I think he's going to follow his instincts, as he says, and just go on that impulse. And we'll see what the political fallout will be.
Okay. I think, as much as Pat would suggest I'm a bit of a Russia hawk normally, President Trump should go in honor of the fact that that alliance, as much as it was dealing with Joseph Stalin, wasn't the greatest guy on the planet, saved the world from the Nazis, Imperial Japan, and the Russians lost a lot of people. Hard for them to spin the American president going there in a bad way. So unfortunately, though, I don't think he will go.